Let's be honest. When you picture the founding fathers or the early settlers of America, you probably don't picture them dripping in diamonds. We have this image of the Puritans wearing black buckles and the rugged frontiersmen wearing buckskin. But that is only half the story. The truth is that colonial America was obsessed with status. If you were a wealthy merchant in Boston or a plantation owner in Charleston, you needed to show it. But here is the problem. America didn't have any gem mines. We didn't have diamond cutters. We didn't have the infrastructure. So how did the colonists get their bling? They faked it. Today we are going to look at the economy of vanity in the 1700s. We are going to talk about why George Washington wore glass shoes. We are going to talk about why babies were forced to chew on red coral. And we are going to look at the dark, superstitious world of memento mori jewelry. We are stripping away the myths of the Revolution to look at what was actually in their pockets. I'm Cody. This is Mystic Apothecary. Let's talk about the gem trade in colonial America. To understand the jewelry of this era, you have to understand the economy. It was called mercantilism. Basically, the colonies existed for one reason: to dig up raw materials like tobacco, indigo, and timber and send them to England. In return, England sent back finished luxury goods. There were no gem cutters in the 13 colonies. None. If you wanted a diamond ring, you didn't go to a local artisan and ask them to source a stone. You placed an order with an agent in London. The local goldsmiths, or jewelers, in places like Philadelphia or New York were mostly retailers. They were menders. They could resize a ring or import a finished piece, but they weren't faceting rough stones. This created a weird dynamic. It meant that American jewelry was always a season or two behind the fashion in London. It was an economy of import. But the biggest shock for modern people is the materials they actually used. If you go to a museum today and look at 18th century buckles or brooches, you might think you are looking at diamonds, but you probably aren't. You are looking at glass. In the 1700s, fake wasn't a dirty word. It was a technological marvel. They called it paste. In the 1730s, a guy in France named Georges Frédéric Strass figured out that if you added a ton of lead to glass, it became incredibly clear and dispersive. It sparkled like crazy. You have to remember the lighting conditions. They didn't have LEDs or halogen bulbs. They had candlelight. Real diamonds in the 1700s were cut into rose cuts, or old mine cuts. They were chunky. And because diamond mining technology was primitive, the stones were often yellowish or gray. In a dim room, a real diamond often looked like a dark lump of rock. But high-quality lead glass? It caught every flicker of the candle. It was brighter than the real thing. So you had the wealthiest people in America, including George Washington, ordering paste shoe buckles and knee buckles. They weren't trying to trick people. They just wanted the sparkle. It was a valid fashion choice, not a cheap knockoff. Now let's talk about the real stones, because when they did import genuine gems, they treated them very differently than we do today. If you bought a diamond ring in 1750, it would almost certainly be set in silver. Even if the band was gold, the actual setting holding the stone was silver. They believed that gold turned the diamond yellow. Silver kept it looking white. Platinum wasn't an option yet because they couldn't get their furnaces hot enough to melt it. But here is the engineering secret. It's called foil backing. Today we set diamonds in open prongs. You can see through the bottom of the stone. We want light to pass all the way through. In the colonial era, every setting was closed back. The stone was encased in a metal cup. Inside that cup, the jeweler would place a tiny piece of reflective metal foil, sometimes colored, sometimes silver. This foil acted like a mirror behind the stone. It punched the light back out at the viewer. It made the stones glow in low light. This is why you have to be incredibly careful with antique jewelry. If you get water inside that closed setting, it ruins the foil. The stone goes dead and turns black. It is ruined forever. So what other stones were they importing? The most common one was garnet, specifically deep red pyrope garnets from Bohemia, which is the modern Czech Republic. Garnets were the stone of the middle class. If you were a shopkeeper's wife, you probably had a garnet ring. They were often set in clusters to look like pomegranate seeds. They were affordable, they were durable, and the red color was rich enough to show up by candlelight. Then you have coral. This one is fascinating because it wasn't just decoration, it was medicine. In the 1700s, infant mortality was terrifyingly high. Parents were desperate for anything that could protect their children. There was a lingering medieval belief that red coral could ward off the evil eye and protect against sickness. So you see these portraits of colonial children, and they are almost always wearing a necklace of red coral beads. They also made these things called whistles and bells. It was a silver handle with a whistle on one end, bells on the other, and a stick of smooth, polished coral sticking out the side. It was a teething toy. The baby would chew on the coral. The parents believed the coral would protect the baby's health, and the silver bells would scare away bad spirits. It was a supernatural pacifier. And we have to talk about pearls. In 1770, cultured pearls did not exist. Every single pearl in the world was natural. It had to be dove for by hand in the Persian Gulf or Sri Lanka. That made round, white pearls astronomically expensive. Only the super rich could afford a strand of pearls. So the colonists got creative. They used seed pearls. These are tiny, irregular, natural pearls, sometimes as small as a grain of sand. They would sew them onto horsehair backing to create intricate, lacy patterns for brooches and hair ornaments. It gave you the look of pearls without the price tag of the crown jewels. Now, geography mattered. The jewelry you wore depended heavily on where you lived. If you lived in the South, in Virginia, or Charleston, life was about imitating the British landed gentry. The plantation owners had massive credit lines with London agents. They ordered the flashy stuff: diamond stomachers, pearl chokers, silk velvet. Archaeologists digging in Williamsburg and Charleston find a lot of paste jewels and gemstones. These people wanted to shine. But if you go north to New England, to the land of the Puritans and the Quakers, it is a different story. The Puritans believed that ostentatious display was a sin. The Massachusetts Bay Colony actually passed sumptuary laws in the mid-1600s. These were laws that made it illegal to wear gold or silver lace if your net worth wasn't high enough. But humans always find a loophole. The loophole was death. The Puritans were obsessed with mortality. They lived in a harsh world. So, jewelry was allowed if it served a moral purpose. This gave rise to the memento mori industry. Memento mori means remember you must die. You were allowed to wear a gold ring if it had a skeleton on it. You were allowed to wear a locket if it contained the hair of a dead relative. Hair jewelry was a massive industry. They would take human hair, weave it into intricate patterns, and set it under rock crystal or glass. It wasn't considered creepy. It was sentimental. It was a way to keep your loved ones close in a world where photography didn't exist yet. So in New England, you see less sparkle and more skulls, less paste, more hair. We also have to touch on the trade that was happening outside the colonies, the trade with Native Americans. When the Europeans first arrived, they tried to trade gemstones. The tribes didn't care. A diamond has no intrinsic use. But the tribes valued wampum. These are purple and white beads made from the quahog clamshell. To the tribes of the Northeast, wampum was a sacred currency. The Dutch and English colonists realized this quickly. They actually started mass-producing wampum beads in factories to trade for furs. It was one of the first examples of industrial counterfeiting in the New World. But in terms of actual stones, there wasn't much crossover. The colonists ignored the turquoise of the Southwest because the trade routes didn't connect yet, and the tribes had no interest in the faceted glass of the Europeans. Finally, we have to look at the makers. The most famous silversmith in American history is Paul Revere. We know him for the Midnight Ride, but his day job was metal. If you look at Paul Revere's ledger books, he wasn't making diamond tiaras, he was making silver spoons, teapots, and gold buttons. He was a technician. When he did use stones, they were usually the coral beads for those teething rings, or paste stones for buttons. He wasn't sitting there with a loop-grading diamond clarity. He was melting down Spanish coins to make a teapot for a merchant in Boston. That is the reality of the era. It was practical, it was resourceful. So the next time you watch a movie about the American Revolution, look at the jewelry. If they are wearing a diamond that looks like a modern brilliant cut, it's wrong. It should look like a dark, moody pool of water. If they are wearing a bright red ruby, it's probably a garnet. And if they are wearing something that sparkles like a disco ball, it's not a diamond, it's glass, and George Washington would have been proud to wear it. The jewelry of colonial America wasn't about the value of the rock. It was about the connection to the old world. It was about trying to build a civilization on the edge of the wilderness and using a little bit of foil and glass to light up the dark. I'm Cody, and this is Mystic Apothecary. Like and subscribe for more gemstone history.